A couple of days ago, I did a video about how Clemson is now officially a broken program. The Tigers went from a Tier 1 program to a Tier 2 program over the last few years, and some could argue maybe they've even fallen to Tier 3. Another school that has fallen on even harder times is the Florida Gators. It feels like those national championships with Tim Tebow were such a long time ago, and many Florida fans would do anything just to go back to that season with Kyle Trask. And ever since then, it has been a dumpster fire for the Gators. They've had a couple of good moments, like their Week 1 win against Utah in 2022, but for the most part, Billy Napier has been a failure at Florida. He was expected to be the next big thing in coaching after coming out of Louisiana, but instead, he's now on the hot seat and has the hardest schedule in the country to try to bounce back from. They got obliterated by Miami in every way this weekend, and the Swamp was completely restless. In today's video, I want to talk about how Florida became a broken program and how they've fallen on such hard times. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about Florida being a dead football program. It's now gotten to the point in 2018 where the memories of Tim Tebow and Urban Meyer winning a national championship were a distant memory. The Gators were slowly becoming an afterthought in the SEC behind Alabama and LSU, and now their most hated rival in the SEC East, the Georgia Bulldogs. In 2017, the Gators, led by Jim McElwain, ended up at 4-7 since their FCS game got canceled due to a hurricane. The Gators knew they needed a good head coach to step up and bring them back to being competitive, and they thought they had their guy in Dan Mullen from Mississippi State. He ended up going 69-46 at one of the toughest jobs in the country, had a superstar player in Dak Prescott, and went to a bowl game every year of his career except for the first. Coach Mullen was considered a great recruiter and had turned Mississippi State into one of the toughest teams in the SEC. If you remember that first ever college football playoff poll, he had the Bulldogs in the running for a national championship throughout the most of that 2014 season, with Dak as his quarterback. He ended up hitting the ground running in Gainesville, as he had a 10-3 season in 2018 and then an 11-2 season in 2019, but the Gators got chewed up by the Georgia Bulldog machine in both years and didn't place any higher than second in the East. It wasn't for a lack of talent though. The Gators consistently had one of the most talented rosters in college football, with guys like Kadarius Toney and Chauncey Gardner-Johnson being some of the most electric players in college football. But his coordinators were notoriously terrible. For example, John Hevesy, who was their OC in 2018 and 19, did not get another job in college football after he was fired from Florida in 2021. Coach Mullen had a sharp decline in competitive football, and his players repeatedly showed lack of discipline. We all remember the cleat eat in 2020 that kept them out of the playoff. We remember the halftime brawl with Mizzou in 2020, and also just he made a lot of weird comments, didn't really recruit that hard, and didn't seem to take his job that seriously. He was fired at the end of the 2021 season after going 5-6 in his last year. His final game came against Mizzou, in which they ended up losing by way of a 2-point conversion in the end zone. They were getting further and further down the SEC hierarchy, and they would have to make a change. To stay relevant, they looked for another Southern head coach with a proven record of winning, and they settled on Louisiana head coach Billy Napier. They were kind of shades of Kirby Smart with this hire, as Napier had been on Nick Saban's staff for quite some time, had deep Southern ties, and was seen as the next big thing. Napier had been at Louisiana since Coach Mullen was at Florida, and had turned the Ragin' Cajuns into a Sun Belt powerhouse. In his 4 years in Lafayette, he brought them to the Sun Belt title game 4 times, winning the last 2, and finished ranked in the top 25 in both of those last 2 seasons, which is hard to do with a Sun Belt program. He was one of the most sought-after coaches in the coaching cycle, and while some people thought he'd go to LSU, he'd end up at Florida for the 2022 season. The Gators had one of the toughest schedules in the country, so they needed to play well from the beginning. They started off the season against number 7 Utah at home, and in one of the early slate's most entertaining games, they actually won 29-26. This was after a late interception from Heisman dark horse Cam Rising, and this had lots of people believing that Napier had already resurrected the Gators program and that it was a sign of big things to come. They shot up to the 12th ranked team in the country, and this ended up being far-fetched. But the very next week against Kentucky at home, the Gators would lose 16-26 in a duel between Will Levis and Anthony Richardson, and instantly there were more questions than answers. The next week against USF, they barely managed to win at home 31-28, and this was not a good USF team, and then the week after that, they lost by 5 at Tennessee after Anthony Richardson's Hail Mary fell short. They managed to win their next 2 games against Eastern Washington and Missouri, who was really struggling at the time, and then played a close game with LSU, but ended up losing by a touchdown. The very next week, they got blown out by Georgia, which didn't really surprise anybody. They were actually able to come back over the next 2 weeks and beat both Texas A&M and South Carolina by a good amount, but then they collapsed at the end of the season. They lost to Vanderbilt in a really bad game where they let Vandy's long snapper score a TD on a muffed punt and then choked against Florida State and lost by a touchdown. They finished the year at 6-6 and then ended up getting blown out by Oregon State in the Las Vegas Bowl 30-3. Even with guys like Anthony Richardson, Montrell Johnson, and Ricky Pearsall on the roster, it was clear that something about Florida was worse than it was under Mullen, and it was worse immediately. A lot of people chalked up the first year under Coach Napier due to being a new scheme and new players in a tough conference, but the next season would prove that Coach Napier really wasn't the right coach for Florida after all. They ended up losing Anthony Richardson to the NFL draft in a top 5 pick, and they replaced him with Graham Mertz from Wisconsin. A lot of people thought before the season this was a really bad idea, as Mertz had struggled in the Big Ten. Honestly, there really was no reason for them to get Mertz, as he was sort of damaged goods. Still though, if his potential would hit, then I think he actually could have been a really good player. But the main quarterback issue in 2023 centered around Jaden Rashada. He was a highly talented quarterback recruit who Napier managed to flip to Florida from Miami, but before spring practices started, he has to be released from his national letter of intent, and he ended up going to Arizona State. Montrell Johnson and Ricky Pearsall were still there though, and those two guys were big-time weapons. There was some hope for the 2023 season, and many hoped that they'd be better than the first. That was proven wrong pretty much immediately, as they went on the road to play against Utah, and without Cam Rising, they lost 24-11, and the game was never really that competitive. What's also funny is that some of their players made fun of Utah's stadium size on Snapchat, but Florida committed a ton of false starts because of how loud the stadium was. It's funny how these things work out, isn't it? Coach Napier did not have them ready for the season at all, and then after a tune-up game against McNeese State, they actually managed to beat number 11 Tennessee at home. This was thanks in large part to running back Trevor Etienne, and Joe Milton also struggled. This was a small glimpse of hope, and they ended up making the top 25 that week and beat Charlotte 22-7. This honestly wasn't that good of a game, and it showed that they were overrated the next week as they lost to Kentucky 33-14. They were able to rebound against Vanderbilt with a 38-14 victory, but this time they would struggle again to South Carolina, and they managed to win 41-39. By this point, some Gator fans were worried that Coach Napier was in over his head, and the Gators turned around and collapsed in the final 5 games of the season. To give them the benefit of the doubt though, they had a very tough 5-game stretch. First, they lost to Georgia, which again wasn't surprising because the Bulldogs were number 1 in the country. It's been a while since the series has even been close, and the Gators ended up losing 43-20. They then turned around and had their worst loss of the year as they lost to a 4-8 Arkansas team 39-36 in overtime. They lose out the remainder of the season, falling 52-35 at LSU, and then they had a chance to change everything. Mizzou was a top 10 team at the time, and despite Graham Mertz getting hurt, backup quarterback Max Brown had led them down the field, and they ended up kicking a field goal. Florida was ahead, and all they had to do was get one more stop. Faced with a nearly 4th and 25 situation, Brady Cook found Luther Burden over the middle for a 4th down conversion, and then Harrison Mevis kicked a game-winning field goal. How things could have been different had Florida won this game. They would have gotten their 6th win of the season, and they would have had a top 10 road victory to put on Napier's slate. Instead, they lost in heartbreaking fashion, and then the reward for that was playing a Florida State team that desperately wanted to go undefeated. They ended up losing 24-15 to Florida State to end the season, despite them having a backup quarterback. That game was kind of funny because it was a battle of backups. While a lot of those games were somewhat close, the Gators just ended up looking apathetic. Graham Mertz actually looked okay at quarterback for the most part, throwing for 2,900 yards and 20 touchdowns, and also 3 interceptions. The running game between Montrell Johnson and Trevor Etienne was also really good, but the Gators weren't competitive when it mattered, and that is what Gator fans expect. So going into the Miami game this season, there was a lot of talk about Coach Napier being on the hot seat. Florida was given pretty much the toughest schedule in all of college football, so many were already saying it was a death sentence for him. Besides that, you had Jaden Rashada, who was actually suing him for all the NIL fiasco, and then Miami was projected to be one of the better teams in the ACC. The Canes went out and got skill players like Cam Ward and Damian Martinez, and also brought back their superstar receiver Xavier Restrepo. All those guys were Heisman hopefuls, and with Florida State and Clemson being weaker than normal, many thought Miami could be the team. Personally, they were my pick to win the ACC. I'm going to say that now. Florida brought in DJ Lagway in their recruiting class, who was the highest ranked quarterback in the class of 2024. But other than that, they didn't really bring in that many immediate playmakers or anyone who could help the Gators compete with the Canes. To make matters worse, they lost Ricky Pearsall to the first round of the 2024 NFL Draft, so who was going to step up at receiver and who was going to make plays? Well, nothing really changed, as the game was pretty much a blowout immediately. Miami would win the game 41-17 in Gainesville, and it honestly felt a lot worse than that. Cam Ward threw for almost 400 yards and 3 touchdowns with a pick. Xavier Restrepo had over 100 receiving yards, and even though the Gators held Damian Martinez at just 65 yards, Miami still outgained Florida in offensive yards 529-261. Cam Ward was doing whatever he wanted throughout that game, and he played with swagger, and Miami knew they were the better team, and Florida just felt like a joke. The Gators defense wasn't the only thing underperforming, as Graham Mertz ended up going 11 of 20 for just 90 yards and an interception, and eventually he went down with an injury that looked a lot worse at first. DJ Lagway came in to see if he could provide a spark, and he ended up throwing a pick. Montreal Johnson did have over 100 rushing yards and a touchdown, but that was about the only bright spot on the day for Florida. Gators fans were sitting in the swamp wondering what the heck was going on, and you could see it on their faces that they had had enough, and they are already ready to run this guy out of town. So what exactly has gone wrong for Florida? Well, college football holds a lot of eras that change the way teams are perceived. Like obviously nowadays, nobody expects Cal or Nebraska to be the powerhouses they were a long time ago, but Florida's fall from grace from being the best team in the state to the worst Power 5 team in the state is honestly kind of surprising considering how fast it happened. Honestly, they are worse than UCF now. UCF just got moved to the Big 12, and it's hard to exactly say what has gone wrong for the Gators, but the fact of the matter is that Florida is just not competitive in games they should be, and they look unprepared for big games, and a lot of that is on Coach Napier. Dan Mullen was fired because the Gators had a ton of talent, but found new and inventive ways to lose. Coach Napier is doing what Mullen did to the program, but worse. Honestly, it kind of feels like it's a little bit of a mistake on Florida's part for firing Coach Mullen in retrospect, and Florida makes so many baffling coaching decisions, and Napier's coordinators are clearly in over their head. Russ Callaway and Austin Armstrong are clearly not prepared for their jobs, as Callaway, for instance, was their tight ends coach last season and was an intern before that. It looks like the best thing Florida can do is get a bunch of screens and jet sweeps, and it's not going to get much better because Florida has one of the toughest, if not the toughest, schedules in college football. It'll be a miracle for even close to 500 this season, and add it to the fact that recruiting has actually gotten worse under Napier and their NIL situation is getting worse, and the sky is officially falling in Gainesville. The worst thing about that is Florida fans are starting to become apathetic about football, which is typically a massive indictment of the program. If your fans don't care about the sport, your sport is failing. Billy Napier hasn't just sunk the program at Florida, he's dang near killed it, and I'm not convinced he's surviving the season unless Florida makes it to a bowl game. But again, since Florida is one of the toughest schedules in the country, I'm not even sure they'll win 5 games this year. Gators fans wanted him gone yesterday, and they are upset with their athletic director for letting it get this bad. But the fact of the matter is that Florida hired him, and he couldn't bring the same level of success from the Sun Belt to the SEC. Lots of smoke was around them pursuing Lane Kiffin, who had a bad record with a lot of talent too, and I think it's more likely they try to go the Dan Mullen route again, as they'll probably get a high-level Power 5 coach, but it's just hard to see who that is right now. While many will say it's a tough situation and a really hard job, ultimately Florida is one of the most prestigious programs in all of college football, and someone will happily take the opportunity. I don't know who it'll be, but for now, we're just going to have to wait and see. Maybe Napier ends up going 11-1 and Florida becomes a playoff team. It could happen, but it probably won't. If you're a Florida fan, what the heck has gone wrong for the program? What is it going to take to fix it? And what other topic should I cover next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.